Welcome today to the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative's sixth and final webinar in our series, Lessons from the Field in a Time of Rapid Change and Crisis. I hope everyone is well and enjoying the arrival of fall, and thank you for tuning in today. Today we'll be talking to Rebecca Waters, who's on the other end here, who I'll introduce here in a minute, and just very excited to have with us today and looking forward to diving in. My name is Ben Williamson. I'm the Executive Director here at NRCC. And to provide just a quick background on the series, as I've stated in previous sessions, but we started it this summer to sort of highlight some of the work in the NRCC community who are at the front end of science, education, communication, sort of in blending environmental and social fields, and give them the chance to discuss their unique approaches. And given just the historical moment that we're in right now, it felt pertinent to give a platform to some of these folks. So each of these conversations has had a bit of a unique tone, but they're all structured around the same 5 questions. So I'll ask the question and then give our guests the chance to respond, and hopefully create sort of a conversational feel to it. And then we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box as we go, and then we'll attend to them at the end. One other little nitty-gritty piece is that this is our last session, so if you'd like to watch any of the previous ones, they are available on our website. And so you can go to the Summer Webinar Series tab at nrccooperative.org and then click on the profile picture of who you'd like to watch. So that's it for logistics. Thank you again for being here, everyone who's joining today. And I will now introduce today's guest, Rebecca Waters. So Rebecca is a wildlife biologist and social scientist who works at the intersection of culture, human rights, and conservation. She's the executive director of the Wolverine Foundation and the founder of the Mongolian Wolverine Project. Rebecca's worked in numerous countries, but most significantly in Mongolia, where she studies wolverines and other climate-sensitive wildlife in collaboration with the staff of the Ulaan Taiga Protected Areas in northern Huvsgul province. And her research centers on the intersection of wildlife biology, social perceptions of wildlife, and conservation, and working within the Mongolian protected area system to find conservation strategies that also preserve human communities and culture. And she first began to go to Mongolia about 20 years ago as a Peace Corps volunteer. Rebecca's also been an NRCC research associate since 2008, and she received a master's from the Yale School of the Environment and holds an anthropology degree from St. Lawrence University. And when she's not in Mongolia, she resides in Bozeman, where she's joining us today. So with that, I'd like to welcome Rebecca and say thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I don't really feel worthy to wrap up this series. I've been watching the previous sessions as I've been able to over the summer, and I think there have been some really great conversations that have been held, and yeah, I look forward to being part of that, and thank you again for having me.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you, and we definitely think that you have a lot to tell us and a lot of stories and a lot of experience. So, so thank you for being here. So we'll just dive right in. So, first question, and you can take this as you'd like, but in your words, what do you do, and how did you get to where you're at, and why does that work matter to you, sort of in the broad sense?
Yeah, I guess I kind of want to say, and this is probably just sort of like a nervous habit of mine, I feel very comfortable at this point in my career, like getting up and giving presentations about wildlife, about wolverines, about Mongolia. Mm-hmm. I'm less practiced talking about myself. That makes me really, really nervous. So yeah, bear with me as I kind of stumble around and try to explain what I do, which isn't always clear to me, and how I got here, which is also sort of a very complicated story. But yeah, what do? I run a project in Mongolia, and ostensibly that's about wildlife, but I think at a deeper level, it's about pulling together the threads of a number of different interests. So I have an undergraduate degree in anthropology from St. Lawrence University, which you mentioned. I have a master's degree from the Yale School of the Environment, which used to be the School of Forestry, and I'm still adjusting to saying that, with a focus in ecology and wildlife. And I have this Peace Corps experience in between those two things, where I went and lived in rural Mongolia for 2 years, doing work on wildlife and conservation. And so the project that I run in Mongolia is about conservation in Mongolia and conserving wildlife, but it's also about some deeper questions about human relationships with wildlife. And I think maybe looking for something beyond the sort of received narrative about what conservation means in North America. That story has always clearly, to me, been rooted in a very colonialist history that makes me a little uncomfortable. It's always made me a little uncomfortable. I don't think I could have always articulated it in that way, but I think part of going to Mongolia was about trying to find a different story than the one that we're typically told about what we're doing and why. So that's the summary. Yeah, and I guess more questions would probably be good, like about what exactly you're interested in hearing about would probably help me.
Yeah, well, I think like my first question there would be like, during those 2 years you're in the Peace Corps, I'm sure that was like you're just getting thrown into a situation and learning about it really rapidly. Like, was that the formative moment for you, to like when you fell an attraction with Mongolia as a place, or like what was it that drew you to Mongolia from that experience?
Yeah, so actually, I'll take it a step back to my undergraduate degree. I actually started my career in human rights work, and that came out of my time at St. Lawrence, when I was working with, I spent a semester abroad in India, and I was doing an independent research project while I was there on Tibetan Buddhist nuns and the role. It was actually supposed to be sort of a like feminist, theoretical look at the role of women in Buddhism. But what it turned into functionally was a series of interviews with Tibetan nuns who had been part of this huge protest movement in the late 80s in China, in Chinese occupied Tibet, and had been imprisoned and tortured and then released, and had fled over the mountains to India and had established themselves in these Tibetan refugee communities. And so that project very quickly went from being this sort of abstract, like, let me, be very academic and investigate this idea that I have about women in religion, to a very grounded, very immediate, here are some people who have suffered extraordinarily and who have not had a chance to talk to anybody about what they've been through. And I became the person that they were talking to about those experiences that they had been through. And so my interest in Mongolia actually came originally out of this interest in Buddhism, because Mongolia was another place that had been a communist country for 70 years, and Buddhism had been really harshly suppressed there. And then in 1989, with the collapse of the communist world, Mongolia had undertaken this democratic revolution, nonviolent, and had started to revive their Buddhist traditions. So originally, I wanted to go to Mongolia to look at that revival of Buddhism and to look at the after effects of 70 years of communist suppression of the religion, to see how people were having a dialogue about the revival of this tradition. And I couldn't get to Mongolia any other way to do the kind of work that I wanted to do other than joining the Peace Corps. That was the path that I identified as the most effective, because it was 2 years in the country, they gave you language training, and you were living at a local level. Now, Peace Corps, being a US government entity, does things like takes a look at your anthropology degree and takes a look at your extracurricular activities and sees that your extracurricular activities include some kind of like, minor environmental activism with the environmental group on campus, and assigns you to be an ecology teacher. So that's what happened to me. I had no environmental background other than like, sort of advocacy-based sympathies. And I had really no ecological training at all. And they decided I was going to be an ecology teacher in central Mongolia. And that's what happened. So the interest in Mongolia predated
Okay.
actually being in the country. Like that's where I wanted to go.
Okay.
The hook, though, the kind of the thing that like bound me there was actually a conversation that I had with my counterpart. So when you're in the Peace Corps, you get a counterpart who you are supposed to work closely with for your entire 2 years. And literally the second day that I knew this woman, her name is Norvo. She was actually an English teacher, so she could speak English. It was before I was fluent in Mongolian. She had been a little bit hostile to me. And I was kind of taken aback by that because I was this very like idealistic, you know, kid, American kid who was like, I'm here to help. And I know lots about environmentalism because of course America is like, you know, our environmental movement is so great. And she actually sat me down out by the river outside of the town where I was living and said, you know, I have to ask you, why do you think you have anything to teach us about how to relate to the environment? And I was so startled by that. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, you know, Genghis Khan, who's Genghis Khan, you know, that's the Mongolian name for Genghis Khan, had environmental laws on the books in the 13th century. You guys just arrived at this stuff like 100 years ago, if that. So what are you doing here? And I think that that question that she asked me just like tripped something that made it impossible to walk away from, because there was this very concrete question that I had become quite interested in, which was, okay, well, she's right. So what am I doing here? And what is this international environmental movement where, you know, people from America and people from European countries go out and act like evangelists for a very particular take on the environmental movement? So, yeah.
That is fascinating, and like gets to like the legacy of what forest management coming out of Europe and how it was moved to the US, and then how we created protected areas. All the whole trajectory of how we think about environmentalism is so sort of erases the fact that like there's a whole entire world out there that has been thinking about or in relationship to environment for many centuries. So I think this is really important, and I'm really interested in this. So could you maybe articulate a little bit closer around like how Mongolia these days like operates with their protected areas with that legacy of environmentalism that's definitely not a Western paradigm. So if that makes sense, just like how is their ideology around protected areas unique?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, too, I want to say that I don't want to do this thing that Westerners sometimes do, where you know we just idealize some kind of purportedly close to nature,
Totally.
you know, culture. That's not what I'm trying to do at all. So keep that in mind as I say what I'm about to say. I am going to talk about what I see to be the positive aspects of Mongolian relationships with the environment and what I've learned from them. But there definitely, this is not to say that Mongolia does not have a lot of environmental problems of its own too. But historically, I think there's a couple of important things to mention. The first is that there's no private property in Mongolia. So there never really has been private property, private land in Mongolia. And that remained true until 2001. At this point, there are like small parcels of private land, but the pasture, the grazing commons, is actually constitutionally protected. So it's in the Mongolian constitution that pasture land will never be privatized. And I think that this foundational, you know, all the way back thousands of years, situation where people are trying to survive and make a living in a very unstable, common landscape results in very different institutions and social relationships and structures of relationship with the environment as well. So that's one important piece. There have always been, Mongolia is ostensibly Buddhist, but it's also heavily animist. And this again is something I don't want to represent, or I want to represent cautiously, but there is your relationships with your neighbors are important, and your relationships with the mountains and these natural entities are also important. So you are always, to some degree or other, maintaining a set of interactions with the environment, with the mountains, with the river, with important trees on the landscape, with the sky. So that too is just something that's like fundamentally different, I think, from the way that Americans have approached conservation, or white Americans have approached conservation through our history. We have a much more materialist view of things, right? And so historically, there have been very strict laws against polluting rivers and things like that. So these are these 13th century laws that Genghis Khan promulgated everywhere he went. And he went a lot of places and conquered a lot of places, right? So he put these laws into effect in those places. There also is a kind of traditional protected area practice where certain mountains are off limits to human travel and to hunting. And that has been transferred in sort of the post-socialist era into the protected areas system, which has also been very heavily influenced by the Russian system. So the Russian system of zapovedniks, a lot of those are strictly off limits to human incursion unless you're doing research. So it's a different model than our national park system. I think Rich Reading talked about this in an earlier conversation as part of this series as well. But there are national parks, and those are open to tourism and what we would think of as recreation to a certain degree. But then there are strictly protected areas, and strictly protected areas at their core zone are off limits to any kind of human travel or encroachment except for research. So, and that kind of reflects these traditional like Hayakhan areas, which are totally taboo for either permanently or for certain seasons of the years where animals are reproducing and things like that. So when we work with our protected areas in Ulaan Taiga, there's a lot of like Western advisor interest in developing ecotourism as this kind of, catch-all, like this is going to be the way that this will bring economic benefit to the community. And there's pushback from the park director and the rangers on that, because that area is not meant to be a place where people go. It's meant to be left to its own devices. It's its own entity. And so, that's those are some of the qualities that are quite different from the American protected area system.
Okay. Great. That was a really helpful sort of orientation to the difference in paradigms that we're talking about here. So before we move on, just to like ground it a little bit more, is how did your work with wolverines get started, and and how is it different between the different protected areas given their management ways of management?
You mean the different protected areas in America versus Mongolia, or
in Mongolia, like say like that you mentioned there's like the national park system where people are allowed to go, and then the research ones. Or I would just be curious, like how do wolverines adapt to different places in Mongolia?
Yeah, so the Wolverine stuff got started originally when I was working in Mongolia. I really wanted to do snow leopard stuff, but snow leopards are almost impossible, right? Because they're this very attractive animal that everybody wants to work on because they're beautiful and they're really cool. And so I kind of remember thinking to myself, like, I need some other animal that gives me an excuse to run around in the mountains, not talk to people, and be in this environment. But it can't be an animal that anybody is like possessive about, or that has already been sort of saturated in terms of the attention that it's gotten. And I came out west after I graduated from Yale, and I was working with NRCC actually, and one of the former executive directors was also working on a Wolverine project. And so I got sort of connected to the Wolverine world through NRCC, and it turned out that there was this unstudied population of wolverines in Mongolia that the Wolverine research community was actually fairly interested in, because of course wolverines in the United States in the lower 48 are kind of the southern edge of the distribution in the Western Hemisphere. In Mongolia, the southern edge of the distribution is in Mongolia. In the Eastern Hemisphere, the southern edge of the distribution is in Mongolia. And so because it's a climate sensitive animal, we know these animals are bound to cold climates. We kind of were curious collectively about what the situation was for wolverines in Mongolia. So that's how I got into Wolverine. And then from there, and NRCC really did give me a platform to do this, because it is the kind of place where if you have a really quirky, unique idea like wolverines in Mongolia, You can't go out and get a job in that, but you can be a research associate at a place like NRCC and kind of have some support for fundraising and a fiscal home and things like that. So I raised a bit of money and I ended up going back to Mongolia and starting this project there. Now, in terms of the adaptation of wolverines to different management systems in Mongolia, that is a question that I cannot answer. Clearly, although I can give you some anecdotal information about it. In the three parks, the three protected areas where I work, Ulaan Taiga actually consists of 3 protected areas. 2 of them are strictly protected areas. So those are the research parks. One of them is a national park. And the national park, again, allows people to travel into the park. The reason that particular park is a national park and not a strictly protected area is because it has a population of reindeer herders who rely very heavily traditionally on hunting. Twice I have skied through all 3 of these protected areas, and twice, so once in 2013 and once in 2019, the ski teams found a lot of wolverine tracks in the strictly protected areas and none in the national parks. Or many, many fewer. In 2013, I think we found maybe 1 set of tracks in the national park. So for whatever reason, and I cannot say that it actually has to do with human presence, it could be something about the ecology or some other factor that I have not identified. But for whatever reason, there were far fewer tracks in the national park than in the strictly protected areas.
Okay.
That, again, that's anecdotal. That's not a conclusion of any kind, but it's an observation.
Totally. And interesting given like what you explained on how they're differently managed. So.
But I will also say that this idea that we have about wolverines in the US, that they require wilderness in a very strict way and they cannot stand people, I don't know that I would say that we see that strictly in Mongolia, because one of the strictly protected areas where we work, Portal Sarduk, we had a base camp there with some students for a semester program that I started. That's another part of this story. But these American students were there for a semester. It started snowing really heavily on September 4th, did not stop. And within 2 weeks, every time we went out, we were finding wolverine tracks, not that far from our base camp. So, it's not like they were avoiding people and not coming down low and not approaching these areas where there was a pretty clear human presence for weeks, right? Like they were there. We never saw them, but they show up on our cameras all the time too. So that's also out there.
Okay, fascinating. So to just move forward to the next question, that was really helpful framing. And this question might be in a different direction, but I think still relates. So this question is we're trying to get at just how are you making sense of the current moment? So number 1 is how has COVID-19 pandemic affected your work? And I know it's been substantial. And then number 2, how are you making sense of all the other many layers of crisis that we're experiencing right now, and don't feel like you have to perform any great answer on all of that together. So just more of just like how are you reflecting and make sense of the many different entangled events and crises that we're facing right now, given your experience with the pandemic and all else.
So the easy question to answer is how has this affected my work in like a sort of like clear material way. Mongolia has probably had one of the best responses globally to coronavirus. They shut their borders in January. And they have a long history of managing, plague outbreaks. So they know how to do a quarantine well, and they know what's required. And they did that. They shut the borders. However, that has had some consequences, including the fact that no foreigners are allowed in. So basically my entire field season was called off. And that was pretty disruptive. I realized that I, don't really have a sense of myself if I'm not working in Mongolia. So that required a little bit of rearranging of my thought processes and my activities. And I don't know, currently I am not really sure when the borders are going to reopen. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to go next year or whether this is kind of a semi-permanent state of affairs. They have said, the Mongolian government has said that they are not reopening their borders until there is a vaccine. So in the meantime, I am communicating over Facebook and with my rangers and the park director, and trying to keep up a good flow of communication, and, you know, doing what we can to keep the research going, and doing what we can to maintain those relationships. So that's how my work has been affected. In terms of how I'm making sense of this moment, I'm not. I don't know. I mean, I think trying to make sense of what's going on right now in the sense of like trying to construct a coherent narrative out of it, like, I don't think you can do that. We're not going to understand this moment until years down the line. But I will say both my parents are historians, so, you know, in my household as I was growing up, we spent a lot of time talking about the fault lines that run through this country's history. And for me, I'm trying not to be cynical about it, and I'm trying not to be defeatist about it. But what we're seeing happening now, it's the manifestation of things that have been going on for decades, you know? So I think what I'm doing is just sort of observing how those things, maybe it's more about observing how my elders were right about things that I didn't want to admit when I was a kid, or like, you know, this sort of rosy picture that I had of like my parents' generation having solved a lot of problems, turns out not to be true. Just reflecting a little bit on that. But I think more than that, trying to ground myself in a position of looking into the future or towards the future, rather than just thinking about the many catastrophic ways that things are falling apart, because this is also a moment where we have the opportunity to reinvent some of the things that have been plaguing us since the founding of the country. And so that's what I'm trying to do. That's how I'm trying to make sense of it. But you know, it's hard emotionally, mentally, physically. It's a really difficult time for everybody, obviously not just for me. So
yeah, I think that's important to like have a sensitivity to the trend that America's been on, and maybe it hasn't been just this arc of progression, and maybe this is an opportunity to sort of correct, or at least come to terms with some of those incongruencies that we've had baked in from the very beginning. Who knows if that'll happen, but like that's clearly what's coming to head right now.
Yeah, and I think I guess I don't want to get into this too much, but between the undergrad experience with Tibetan refugees and the Mongolia experience, I also worked in Bosnia. And that was 1999, so it was the height of the Kosovo conflict, and it was 5 years after the Dayton Peace Accords. And then subsequently, after Mongolia, I also worked in Cambodia for 2 years. And so I've been in a lot of places where societies have collapsed, and I've been in the aftermath of those collapses, and I've seen what it does to people, and I've seen how people respond to it on both a individual level and also on a society-wide level. And I guess, and Mongolia collapsed too. I mean, that was a place where overnight, you know, 70 years of communist ideology and narrative, collectivization, a story about people buying into this system of relationships that was sort of overseen by the Soviet Union, that vanished overnight. Everything lost value and meaning to people, to most people in Mongolia, like people who were employed, people who had bank accounts, or, you know, people who were herding for the collectives, people who were maintaining equipment for these collectives. Overnight, that just vanished. I kind of feel like we're going through something like that right now. Like everything is just like all of the things that we've taken for granted as being true are just disappearing. That also happened in Yugoslavia when it came apart, right? But the responses to those two situations were extremely different. And I think there are, like, you know, measurable reasons for that. But I'm just hoping that as a nation, we can take a more Mongolia-like response rather than a more Yugoslavia-like response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well put. I think like a shifting of our meaning making systems is happening right now. So
yeah, and that's uncomfortable for people. I mean, it's uncomfortable if you have to do it for yourself individually, but to try to struggle with that as a nation
mm-hmm.
is really, really hard. And so, of course, it's going to be difficult, but we can't just we can't panic, we can't respond in fear, and we can't just wallow in it. You know, there's got to be something that we're aiming towards.
Right. And that's what I'm unsure. Like, I don't know what that vision is right now. I don't know if anybody has a collective sort of vision in the common interest, but maybe that'll emerge over the next several years, but we'll see. I don't know.
I think that some of the pieces of it are there. And I think that the leadership, you know, there, when you sent out this really thorough like guidelines for the speakers, which by the way, I really appreciate. I've been invited to talk in a lot of venues, and very rarely have I had that degree of thorough preparation. But there were a lot of questions about, you know, failures of leadership in this country. And I think we can look, if we're speaking hierarchically, we can certainly look upwards to Washington, D.C. and just see catastrophic like disintegration of leadership, right? But we can also look laterally across at our fellow citizens. And I think that we can see in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the movement at Standing Rock, a different kind of leadership that's emerging. And there are groups that are, I don't think the coherent narrative of what that future looks like is necessarily there, but the pieces of what it looks like in terms of justice for marginalized groups, or for groups of people who have always been marginalized throughout the history of this country, are there. And those visions of justice for those are tied to a vision of justice for everybody. And they're also tied to a vision of environmental justice and climate justice. And so I think it has the potential to come together, but I also feel like at this point we don't have a kind of unifying narrative yet, but the pieces are there. And that I do find a little bit hopeful. Like the leadership that we should be looking to is not the traditional definition of leadership at this point. So.
Totally. I think like thinking about movements like the climate justice movement is like providing a different vision, alternative vision than we've seen before. So there are elements to like grab onto at sort of the ground level that provide some sort of path forward.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the climate justice movement, the environmental justice movement, for those of us who have been in the environmental movement for a little bit longer, you know, it does require a bit of a reworking of how we think about environmentalism. But I would just encourage people to be open to that, because you can't, everything is just so interlinked. And I have a trouble articulating, I like complexity and I like systems and I like thinking about systems, but it's a little bit difficult sometimes to articulate exactly how those things are connected. And I'm still, you know, learning from these leaders who are leading these justice movements myself. So it's definitely not my role to be the one who's like mainly explaining these things, but those things are really tied together. And I think that we should just be open to changing the way we're thinking about, you know, serving the environment. So,
which leads really well to the next question. And you've mentioned this a bit, and I think you're a prime person to ask this to, knowing that you've been involved with NRCC for so long, but NRCC has always sort of promoted an approach to environmental problems that tries to work across like disciplines and encourage multiple and diverse perspectives on issues. And I think that, you know, in a lot of ways, your work as a representative of that is like working across these different spaces, especially given your evolution of going from anthropology into getting thrown into ecology and environmental work. So I was wondering if you could speak broadly about how you, even today, sort of seek to be interdisciplinary in your work.
Yeah, I guess I just instinctively have always been pretty interdisciplinary, but then working with Susan and hearing her talk about the difficulties of actually implementing interdisciplinary programs made me realize that, you know, not everybody is going to be really enthusiastic about, you know, having somebody from some other field pop up in their office and say, you know, hey, do you want to start a program in Mongolia with me? Or like, do you want to come and like ride a horse across Mongolia and contribute your expertise to this project I'm trying to put together? So I think for me, and I'm pretty sure Rich Reading also said this in his presentation, you know, it's not about me figuring out how to do everything. It's really just about finding the people who are interested and who have the talents and the skills. So the first step for me is just knowing what you need, right? Like you think about the entire system, you think about the context that you're working in, and you say like, what is the problem? What is the situation demanding? And then the next part of that is, you know, who do I know who can fulfill those different needs? So, and this actually fits really well with Chinggis Khan too, because I believe that he said at some point about leadership that he himself was not a particularly gifted or talented leader. He just was fortunate to be surrounded by talented and gifted people, and had a kind of a gift for figuring out who those people were. So, you know, the Chinggis model, like you want to be interdisciplinary, you want to rule an empire, same approach, right? Find the right people. And maintain your relationships with them. You know, make sure that you are giving them appropriate credit, and make sure that you are really appreciating the contributions that they're making, and make sure that there is a kind of reciprocity in whatever you're doing with your collaborators. I think that's another Mongolian lesson, right? Reciprocity, everything functions on a reciprocal relationships. Nothing should ever be strictly transactional, and just make sure that, you know, those flows of goodwill and relationship remain strong.
Totally. Which, like, one of the other tenets of NRCC is being really contextual wherever you're working at. And so knowing that you've gone really deep into Mongolia culture and social process, what was that process like, learning the context, and then how do you fit yourself, a Western person, into that context, and how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is another really sensitive topic too, because, you know, I would not ever claim to be Mongolian or to really have like a sense of identification with being Mongolian. But I think that the approach that I took, and this was instinctive, it wasn't something that I thought through before. Certainly the approach that Peace Corps encourages, and the approach that I wanted to take, was immersive within the language and the culture. Mm-hmm. And so I was dropped into a town where nobody spoke English, so I had to learn the language. And you know, I was living in a ger, which the wider audience probably knows as a yurt. And so there were things that I just had to figure out because of where I was. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to stay warm, if I wanted to, I'm an introvert, but I still didn't want to spend 2 years sitting in this town not talking to anybody. So yeah, it was just a matter of necessity. It was like day-to-day life. And then beyond that, I think as an environmentalist, you know, coming of age as an environmentalist in Mongolia was probably a very different experience than coming of age as an environmentalist in the US, where I was out on the land with the rangers, learning how to have those correct relationships with wildlife and with mountains and with rivers from Mongolians. And so I think I just put myself into the position of being a student, and approaching everything with that kind of mindset. Yeah. And really trying to maintain an approach that's primarily based in curiosity, rather than an approach that's based in an assumption that I know what the situation is.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a pretty embodied version of inquiry versus just purely intellectual. And I think that's just thinking about your past, like it's clearly you like have a really embodied relation to that place and how you've looked at it, the lens that you've gained.
Yeah. And then I have to say too, and I'm not just saying this because it's an NRCC event, but the intellectual framework that the policy sciences provide, like this kind of analytical framework for understanding the wider sort of policy situation and stakeholders and things like that. That's the balance to that very embodied, very like grounded, like you're in this place and you're just living your life day to day and trying to discern what the situation is through your day-to-day interactions and relationships. The other piece of that is making sure you've ticked all those boxes on things that you might not be interacting with on a day-to-day basis, like the Ministry of Environment, or, you know, a mining company that is a stakeholder in environmental debates and lawmaking in a country. So yeah, I think finding a balance of that sort of embodied approach and the intellectual tools for being more analytical is also helpful.
Could you, I've asked this to a few other speakers, and this is a big question because the policy sciences is a big but like what is your understanding of the policy sciences for maybe our listeners who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really about like having a good overview of the situation and making sure that you're taking into account players or perspectives that you might not be naturally inclined to consider. And problem definition has been a really important part. I think the three things that I took away from it that stick with me the most and that I still teach my students, the problem definition, you know, don't assume you know what the problem is, make sure you're talking to people about that. The values, you know, understanding people's values is a really important part of the policy sciences process. So often people will say that a given situation is about one thing for them, but there actually are a set of values that are underlying that position that they're taking that may not necessarily seem immediately obvious. And so delving into that a little bit and understanding better where these people are coming from is very helpful. And then the other thing that Susan talked about a lot when I was her student was common interest. So understanding what a common interest outcome might be versus a special interest outcome. Those are three things that I think that the policy sciences does for me. And those are the things that I kind of rely on or go back to tools.
Yeah, that's well stated. And I think distills some of the pretty fundamental concepts of the policy sciences that, I mean, I know that pretty much everyone we've talked to on these sessions sort of operates under. So thank you for that. The fourth question that I wanted to ask, and you've sort of already touched on this a bit, but I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more broadly and specifically towards like how you as an environmental practitioner have evolved in your ideology and thinking about environmental problems as also human problems. And that's a big question.
Yeah, I think I came to it from the human side first. And so you know, because I have this anthropology background and my original set of questions was about culture and people's sort of cultural practices, and environmental practices were tangled up in that for me. I don't think I've ever seen environmental problems as totally divorced from human problems. They're always human problems. You know, we are the ones who are living on this planet and making these problems for our fellow non-human entities. And so I don't think I've really, that part of it has not been a revelation to me, but I think having a more nuanced understanding of, again, like stakeholders, special interests, the policy process and the politics of it, that piece of it is not quite as instinctive to me. So that's certainly something that has evolved. And then I told you I was going to just come right out and say this when we talked, but you know, I think that having worked in Mongolia in this post-socialist context, I think I've just become more radicalized in terms of like, you know, I don't know, I guess I'm just a socialist now. And I think that the problem is capitalism and neoliberal capitalism specifically, but I think I've become increasingly frustrated with the kind of these platitudes of a system that thinks that you can put a dollar value on everything and buy your way to solving a problem that is primarily based in overconsumption. You can't, you know, you can't do that. We have to shift something constitutively, as Susan would say. You know, there's a major set of constitutive problems in the way that we that we see the value of the natural world and the value of our fellow human beings and the value of our fellow non-human beings. And so I think I have, whereas at the start of my environmental career, I was a little more willing to entertain things like, you know, ecosystem services, and let's put a dollar value on this, and let's talk about wolves as like drivers of tourism so people can see the monetary benefits of having wildlife on the landscape. I find myself increasingly impatient with that. Like, we really need to rethink this at a base value level. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is me putting onto you, but it must feel frustrating to come back to this country after working in Mongolia and to see the way that we work in our environmental issues. And I guess my question here is, someone like yourself who lives in the GYE in Bozeman, is there anything, and this is a big question too, is there anything that you would sort of recommend on the constitutive level, whatever level you want to talk about how we could think about the GYE as a sort of system from your experiences in Mongolia?
I mean, nothing that's going to come across as anything less than super idealistic and unrealistic. But yeah, I mean, I actually don't know if I want to venture into making some of those suggestions because I feel like at this point, because of the like tension of the pandemic and the frustrations of the past few months, I'm going to say something that just sounds completely unrealistic and radical.
Totally fair.
But no, I mean, I think it does. I'm really hesitant to engage in this also capitalist Western idea of like individual improvement as the route to solving our problems. Like, I don't think that navel gazing is going to get us anywhere, but I do think if people would engage more realistically with our history in this area and understand our history more contextually. And when I say our, I mean, you know, the history of colonization by European Americans, and really look honestly at the values that do underlie conservation and the way conservation is funded and the way conservation narratives are constructed. I think that would be a good start.
That's a great piece of advice. I think that's something we don't often think about as the GYE as having a place with a ton of history. We think of it as a snapshot in time right now.
Yeah.
So I think that's great advice.
As long as that's satisfactory, then I don't have to say abolish private property and let's go back to it being like private commons, you know.
That'll suffice for now. I'll move on to the last question, and I wanted to just put a plug out to the attendees. If you guys are starting to get questions, feel free to type them in, and I just see one just popped up. So the last question before we get to Q&A is, and I prepped you for this, is what would be 3 pieces of advice that you'd like to offer the audience and the greater world, however you'd like to take that?
Yeah, this is the one that I thought about the most and was most perplexed about. And I went around to all of my close friends and I was like, what advice should I offer? And they were like, why are you asking us? So I guess my first piece of advice is just to go back to that piece about relationships, right? Like, have your good friends who you can go to and, you know, ask, you know, what should I advise people in this moment? Maintain your relationships, value your relationships, whether those relationships are with your fellow conservationists, with your family, with the friends who are dear to you, with people who you don't necessarily agree with, but who are still part of your community. The people who are distant are not part of your in-group, but they're your fellow citizens and they're a part of this process and their rights are important. And you know, you need to have a logical framework to protect those rights, and you need to maintain your relationship with these distant people through that framework of defending their rights. And of course, with the non-human entities in our environment as well. So maintain your relationships with the mountains and the rivers and the landscape, and understand what's being given and what's being taken in your interactions with those entities, all of them, the human and the non-human alike. So that's my first piece of advice. I guess the second piece of advice, and this is more about anxieties around the state of collapse in our society, and I think the political situation, is just don't get hung up on being a purist about things. I feel like zealotry fundamentalism and purity obsessions are these are things that fundamentally come out of like sort of a Christian tradition, right? But they play out in all of these very bizarre ways, like whether it's about the food you eat or which candidate you're going to vote for. Don't do that. Please lose the purity obsession, okay, people? You know, be pragmatic in your approach to things, and that's part of being contextual as well. Like, don't hold so closely to some ideal that you're willing to sacrifice the people who are around you and the entities that are around you to prove a point. I know that seems like a really specific piece of advice, but I've had so many interactions with people where I've been really frustrated, and I feel like there's maybe some, you know, harm that's being done because of this like really rigorous attachment to particular ideals. Third piece of advice. Let's see, what was my third piece of advice? Oh yeah, so and the third piece of advice is something I've actually already said, which is use your imagination. Everybody needs to do this. You need to use your imagination to envision the future you want to live in, not just the apocalypse that we're living through, okay? Like describing that apocalypse and using your imagination to see the disastrous elements of it. You have to do that, but the next step is to push your imagination forward into the world that you are living towards, right? That's the thing I want to hear people start talking about. Because I think fear is really easy to give into, and a sense of panic is really easy to give into. And this is the kind of stuff when I was talking to refugees from Kosovo, when I was working in Bosnia in the aftermath of that conflict, and when I was working in Cambodia with people who had lived through the Cambodian genocide, you know, that sense of collapse, the sense of panic, the sense of fear, those things take over in society really easily. And so I think to balance that, we need to also be talking about what we want in the future rather than just what we don't want and what we're scared of.
That was amazing and really helpful, and all sort of summed up everything you've said. So thank you so much for that. That was great. And I think it's the point of like having close contact with your neighbors, humans and non-humans, creates an empathetic response that also promotes an imagination for the future. So I think that was really good, and I appreciate that.
Giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
So we have about like 6 or 7 more minutes, and so I'll just open it up to the attendees right now. So if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box. So we have one question right now from Marissa. Thank you for asking this. And the question is, does Mongolian thought provide some helpful ways of addressing problems with Western systems thinking? She's a Mongolian expert born and raised in the GYE.
Marissa and I collaborate on almost all of our work in Mongolia, so I'm really glad that she's on this call to keep me honest and in check when I'm making claims about this stuff. I guess, Marissa, I don't know if you can clarify, but when you say problems with Western systems thinking, do you mean that Western thinking is not systematic enough, or that systems thinking itself is a bit mechanistic and tricky? I don't know if you can clarify that in the time that we have.
Marissa, do you have a response?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I'm just not clear on whether she means that, you know, Western systems thinking is in itself a problem, or whether, you know, Westerners are not adept at systems thinking, and whether there are solutions or like potential pathways within Mongolian thought processes for addressing that issue.
One way I would be curious, oh, here she goes. I think it goes against what you were both talking about vis-a-vis context. I guess, I mean, I think systems thinking is such a term that we're seeing all the time in environmentalism. Could you maybe just provide like what your understanding of that is?
Yeah, I guess it's thinking about so you have an ecosystem, you have a human system, you have a series of political systems, and it's just thinking more habitually about how all of those parts are interacting with each other. And a lot of environmental work that I've seen and ecological work that I've seen tends to focus on like bits and pieces of that. It's quite siloed. It's quite technocratic. So, you know, I think when I say that systems thinking is interesting to me and complexity is interesting to me, I feel like we generally, Westerners and Americans specifically want to reduce things to a component part, and then they just want to address that component part. And that's the thing that I find quite counterproductive. So I think, again, I don't want to generalize and say Mongolians think this way or that way, but that sort of Western scientific approach to things where you are just focusing on this one little piece of the problem without regarding the rest of it, that I don't find to be as common amongst the folks that I work with. So, you know, there's still this kind of, with the rangers especially, I'm thinking about being out on the landscape with them and the way that they do, a lot of them have biology training and they're highly educated, they've been to college. Some of them have biology degrees, but they're still willing to make reference to things that they're observing in the environment that may not immediately seem pertinent if you are in this Western scientific mode, but that are, you know, actually grounded in this sort of traditional ecological knowledge and the knowledge that comes from being out on the landscape. And so I guess I would say, I don't know if that's something that we can say is in, you know, quote unquote Mongolian thought, but it's certainly a practice that I see being done and that seems very different from being in the field with a lot of Western scientists. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good description of how we often take the parts away from the whole and focus on individual parts. And so Katie has a question here as a follow-up. Do you see any successful examples of effective systems thinking in the GYE, either by individuals or groups or collective efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think NRCC does do a good job of trying to be very contextual and trying to encourage others to be contextual. Katie Christensen also, I very much enjoyed her presentation, so it's nice to see a question from her. I have to say that for the past 2 years, because my work in Mongolia was picking up so much, I sort of stepped back from really paying very close attention to things that were going on within the GYE. So I would like to sort of not, you know, talk about things that I actually don't have a really good grounding in. But I certainly do know individuals who are doing good work in the GYE. And again, they're affiliated with institutions, and I'm not sure I want to point to those particular people at this point. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of like duck out of that question because of the fact that I haven't really been paying attention to it for the
Okay, no problem.
Sorry.
My last final question is just like, what are your, knowing that you might not be able to get to Mongolia, what are the next your next phase look like? Or hopefully you get back to Mongolia. I mean, that's the best case scenario.
That's the best case scenario. I honestly don't know what I'm going to do if I can't go back to Mongolia. I think Rich talked about this too, but if you work internationally and you do have these very close working relationships and these close cultural and like social relationships with people who are in other countries, it really feels like you are without, like it really feels alienating. It's like you're without a limb. To not be able to go and to be there and to have those kind of interactions is a huge and disorienting loss. So I think that the best case scenario is definitely to go back to Mongolia. I'm applying to PhD programs, and yeah, beyond that, I think I'm also going to refrain from answering that question because it feels quite personal and I am in a state of great uncertainty and I don't want to inflict that on everybody watching this.
As we all are in a lot of uncertainty for most of us. So that definitely makes sense. So we're at our closing time here. So I hope so much that you're able to get back to Mongolia in the next year to 2 years. And I'd like to thank you for being with us today. This was really, really interesting. And I think it could be another hour as far as like diving into a lot of those details. So thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the people who have joined too. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Cool. Yeah. And thank you to the audience. And so just to wrap up here, I'd just like to say thank you to anybody who's joined any of these sessions from here back to July. And so I encourage anybody who hasn't been able to watch all the episodes, all the sessions, to go back and watch them. They'll be living on our website on NRCC. website. And so I think with that, I'll just wrap it up here, and I hope everyone has a safe and healthy finish to the year. There's a lot going on, and so I hope everyone sort of conserves their energy going forward. So thank you again, Rebecca, for being here.
Thank you.
All right, well, I'll sign off here. And I also would like to say, if anyone has any questions or feedback on the webinar series, you can reach out to me directly, or anything, questions around NRCC. So thank you so much to Rebecca and to the audience, and we'll sign off here. Thank you.